The rain fell in heavy sheets the day Richard buried his daughter. The cemetery was a blur of black umbrellas and muffled sobs, but Richard stood motionless, his hands trembling against the polished wood of Emily's casket. She looked peaceful, as if she were sleeping. Her chestnut hair fanned out around her face, her lips slightly parted, the way they always were when she dozed off on the couch during movie nights. But the stillness was all wrong. Emily was never still. She was laughter echoing through the house, the sound of her guitar strumming softly in her room, the way she'd hum absent-mindedly while grading papers. Now she was gone. The accident had been quick, they said. A truck running a red light. No time to brake, no time to scream. The police had handed Richard her belongings in a small plastic bag. Her cracked phone, a silver bracelet he'd given her for her 21st birthday, and a folded note she'd written to herself, "Call Dad Sunday, tell him about Daniel." Daniel? The name gnawed at Richard. Who was he? A friend? A boyfriend? Why had Emily never mentioned him? That night, Richard sat in Emily's empty childhood bedroom, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, the one she'd named Mr. Bubbles when she was 5. The walls were still covered in her old band posters and scribbled poetry. He traced his fingers over the grooves of her handwriting on her desk, where she'd once carved, "I love Dad," with a compass in middle school. The house was too quiet. The world was too quiet without her. Then, 1 week later, the phone rang. The coroner's voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Mr. Thompson, there's something you need to know. During the autopsy, we discovered Emily was pregnant, about 2 months along." The words slammed into Richard like a second death. His knees buckled. Pregnant. Emily had been carrying a child, his grandchild, a life he never knew existed. Why hadn't she told him? Was she scared? Was she in trouble? The questions spiraled, but the answers were buried with her. With shaking hands, Richard drove to Emily's apartment, the one she'd been so proud of renting on her own. The door creaked as he stepped inside, the air still smelling faintly of her vanilla perfume. Her lesson plans were neatly stacked on the kitchen table, her coffee mug still in the sink. And then he saw it. A small, leather-bound journal peeking out from under her pillow. Her diary, the one she'd kept since she was a teenager. Richard hesitated. This was private, but he needed to know. He needed to understand. He opened it. The first page was dated 3 months ago. Met Daniel today. He's different, kind, listens like no one else does. Richard's throat tightened. He turned the page. Richard's fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages of Emily's diary, each word pulling him deeper into a world she had kept hidden. The entries started innocently. Work frustrations, funny student stories, her, excitement about decorating her new apartment. But then Daniel's name appeared more and more. "Daniel brought me coffee today. He remembered I like extra caramel. No one remembers that." Richard's chest ached. He had remembered. He had always brought her caramel lattes on Sunday mornings when she still lived at home. But now, someone else was doing it. Someone else was making her smile. The jealousy was irrational, but it burned anyway. Then came the entry that made his breath stop. "I think I love him. It's terrifying. But when he looks at me, I feel safe, like I can finally breathe." Richard's vision blurred. Emily had never been reckless with her heart. After her mother died, she had built walls, careful not to let anyone in too deep. But Daniel had broken through. Who was he? Why hadn't she told her own father about the man she loved? The next page held the answer. Dad would freak out if he knew, not because of Daniel, but because of who he is. Richard's pulse spiked. What did that mean? Was Daniel married? Dangerous? A criminal? His hands shook as he turned another page, and then, there it was. A name. A last name. Daniel Hartwell. The world tilted. Hartwell. He knew that name. He knew it too well. 20. Years ago, Richard had worked as a prosecutor. His biggest case, the corruption trial against Michael Hartwell, a real estate mogul who had embezzled millions, leaving hundreds of families in financial ruin. Richard had been relentless, burying Hartwell under evidence, securing a conviction that sent him to prison for 15 years. The man had sworn revenge in the courtroom, screaming that Richard would lose what he loved most. At the time, Richard had dismissed it as the rage of a defeated man. But now his daughter had fallen in love with a Hartwell. Was Daniel Michael's son? His nephew? His brother? Richard's stomach twisted. Had Emily known? Had Daniel known who she was? Was any of this real, or had it all been some twisted revenge plot? He tore through the rest of the diary, searching for clues. Then, near the end, he found it. A folded ultrasound photo tucked between the pages. A tiny, blurry shape. His grandchild. Emily had written beside it, "We're telling Dad this weekend. I'm scared, but Daniel promised he'd be there. He says no matter what, we're family now." Family. The word was a knife. Richard's hands, clenched around the photo. If Daniel was a Hartwell, if this was all some sick game, had Emily's accident even been an accident? The police had said the truck driver fled the scene. No arrests, no suspects, just a tragic hit and run. But now, nothing felt like a coincidence. He grabbed his coat and stormed out into the night, the diary clutched in his grip. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. The drive to the police station was a blur of streetlights and swirling thoughts, each one darker than the last. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, the diary resting on the passenger seat like a silent witness to everything he had just uncovered. He needed to see the accident report again, needed to know if there was anything he had missed, any detail that might connect Daniel Hartwell to Emily's death. The moment he walked into the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the tired faces of officers working the night shift. Sergeant Ruiz, the detective who had handled Emily's case, looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to pity as he recognized Richard. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, standing up, "what can I do for you?" Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. He slapped the diary onto the desk, opened to the page where Emily had written Daniel's full name. "I need everything you have on this man. Now." Ruiz hesitated, his eyes flickering over the name. "Sir, I understand you're grieving, but unless you have reason to believe—" "My daughter was pregnant," Richard interrupted, his voice cracking. "She was in love with a Hartwell. And if you knew what that name means to me, you wouldn't be standing there acting like this is just some coincidence." The detective's face went still. He exhaled sharply, then motioned for Richard to follow him into a private room. The file on Emily's accident was thin, too thin for a case that had ended a life. Ruiz spread the documents across the table. Witness statements, the coroner's report, a grainy traffic camera still of the truck that hit her. But one detail stood out. The truck had no license plates. And the witness who called 911? A man who refused to give his name, claiming he was just passing by. Richard's blood ran cold. "You didn't think that was suspicious?" he demanded. Ruiz shifted uncomfortably. Hit and runs are hard to solve. Without plates, without a solid description. Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at the traffic camera image, at the blurry figure of the driver, just a shadow, behind the wheel. But then he saw it, on the dashboard, a small, fuzzy shape. He pointed. "What is that?" Ruiz squinted. "Could be anything. A figurine, a family crest," Richard finished, his voice hollow. The Hartwells had one. A twisted, ornate H inside a shield. He had seen it 100 times during the trial. This wasn't an accident. This was a murder. He stood abruptly, the chair screeching behind him. "I want this case reopened, and I want Daniel Hartwell brought in for questioning. Ruiz frowned. On what grounds? We have no evidence linking him to— Then get some, Richard snarled. He turned to leave, but Ruiz called after him. Mr. Thompson, if you're right about this, if this was deliberate, you need to be careful. These kinds of people don't stop. Richard didn't answer. He was already out the door, the night air biting his face as he strode to his car. He knew exactly where Daniel would be. Emily's diary had mentioned his workplace, a downtown law firm, Hartwell and Associates. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was monstrous. The Hartwell and Associates building loomed before him, a sleek tower of glass and steel that seemed to sneer at the modest skyline of the city. Richard stood across the street, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his fingers curling and uncurling at his sides. He had spent the entire night poring over every detail in Emily's diary, every news article about the Hartwells he could find, every thread that might connect them to her death. Michael Hartwell was still in prison, that much was certain, but his empire had lived on. His younger brother, Victor, had taken over the family business, and whispers of corruption still clung to the name like a stain. And then there was Daniel. Emily's Daniel. The man who had made her feel safe. The man who might have gotten her killed. Richard crossed the street, his footsteps heavy with purpose. The lobby was all marble and hushed voices, the kind of place where money moved silently behind closed doors. The receptionist, a polished woman with a practiced smile, barely glanced up as he approached. "Can I help you?" Richard leaned in, his voice low. "I need to see Daniel Hartwell. Now." The woman's smile faltered. "Do you have an appointment?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Tell him it's about Emily Thompson." For a moment, the woman hesitated, her fingers hovering over the phone. Then something in Richard's expression must have convinced her, because she picked up the receiver and murmured into it. A minute later, the elevator doors slid open and a security guard stepped out. "Mr. Hartwell will see you," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes were wary. Richard followed him into the elevator, the air thick with tension as they ascended. The doors opened onto a sprawling office, all dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows. And there, behind a massive desk, sat Daniel Hartwell. He was younger than Richard had expected, mid-20s, with sharp features and Emily's favorite shade of caramel latte sitting untouched on his desk. But it was his eyes that struck Richard the most. They were red-rimmed, swollen, the eyes of a man who had been crying. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel stood, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Emily's father." Richard's hands clenched into fists. "You knew who she was." Daniel flinched as if struck. "Not at first," he said hoarsely. "Not until she told me her last name. And by then, it was too late. I already loved her." Richard took a step forward, his voice a dangerous growl. "Did you know about the baby?" Daniel's face crumpled. He sank back into his chair, his hands shaking as he dragged them through his hair. "Yes," he choked out. "We were going to tell you together. She was so scared. She thought you'd hate her. Hate me." He looked up, his eyes swimming with tears. "But she wanted you to be part of our lives. She loved you so much." Richard's chest ached. He wanted to rage, to scream, to demand answers, but the raw grief on Daniel's face was too familiar. It mirrored his own. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Richard with trembling hands. "She wrote this for you, the night before it happened. She never got to send it." Richard unfolded the letter. The first line shattered him all over again. "Dear Dad, I have so much to tell you." The words on the page blurred as Richard's vision swam with unshed tears. Emily's handwriting, so achingly familiar, seeming to rise off the paper like a ghost reaching out to him. "Dear Dad, I have so much to tell you. First, I'm sorry. I should have told you about Daniel months ago, but I was scared. Not of you, never of you, but of how much this might hurt you when you found out who he was." Richard's breath hitched, his fingers tightening around the edges of the letter as if clinging to the last physical piece of his daughter's voice. Daniel is Michael Hartwell's nephew. He didn't know who I was when we met, just like I didn't know who he was. By the time we realized, it was too late. We'd already fallen in love. Dad, he's not like his family. He left all of that behind. He's kind and gentle, and he makes me feel like Mom must have felt with you." A sob caught in Richard's throat. Emily had barely remembered her mother. She'd been only 4 when the cancer took her, yet she'd woven stories of their love from the fragments Richard had shared over the years. To hear her compare what she had with Daniel to that love was like a knife twisting in his ribs. The letter continued, each word a revelation. "There's something else. I'm pregnant. 2 months along. We were going to tell you this weekend. Daniel was so nervous he practiced his speech in the mirror like a dork." A wet laugh escaped Richard despite himself, the image so vivid it hurt. "I know this is a lot. I know the Hartwell name carries weight for you. But please, Dad, meet him. See him the way I do. And know that this baby, your grandbaby, is going to be so loved." The letter ended with her signature flourish, a little heart over the I in Emily, just like she'd done since she was a little girl. Silence hung thick in the office, broken only by the muffled sounds of the city beyond the windows. Richard slowly lowered the letter, his gaze lifting to Daniel, who sat with his head bowed, shoulders shaking silently. The anger that had fueled Richard since the coroner's call was still there, simmering beneath his skin, but now it was tangled with something else, something far more dangerous: doubt. "Did you know?" Richard's voice was rough, scraped raw by grief. "About the truck? About what happened to her?" Daniel's head snapped up, his face ashen. "No. God, no. I loved her. I would never—" His voice broke. "The police questioned me for hours after the accident. I thought it was just a horrible coincidence. But then I started digging. The truck was stolen. The security cameras near the intersection malfunctioned that day." He swallowed hard. "My uncle's old contacts are still out there. People who owe him favors. People who might do something like this for him." A cold dread slithered down Richard's spine. "You think Michael ordered her killed?" Daniel's hands clenched into fists on the desk. "I think someone did, and I think I know who." He reached for his phone, pulling up a photo, a grainy surveillance still of a man in a hoodie near Emily's apartment the night before the accident. "This is Marcus Vey. He was my uncle's problem solver, and he's been following me for weeks." Richard's blood turned to ice. This wasn't grief anymore. This was a hunt. The weight of what Daniel had just revealed pressed down on Richard like a physical force, the air in the office suddenly too thick to breathe. Marcus Vey. The name rang in his skull like a gunshot. He remembered it from the trial, buried in old police reports. A shadowy figure who'd done Michael Hartwell's dirtiest work, the kind of man who could make evidence disappear and witnesses vanish. And he'd been watching Emily. Following her, the realization sent a white-hot rage through Richard's veins, his hands trembling not with grief now, but with something far more volatile. Vey had taken his daughter, had taken his grandchild, had stolen the future they were supposed to have. Daniel was already moving, shoving files into a briefcase with frantic urgency. "I've been tracking Vey since the accident," he said, voice low and clipped. "He's been lying low, but he slipped up yesterday. Used a credit card under an alias at a motel on the edge of the city." He pulled up a map on his phone, stabbing a finger at a blinking dot. "Here, room 214. If we move now, we might catch him before he—" "No." Richard's voice cut through the room like steel. "You're not going anywhere near him." Daniel. froze, his face twisting in protest. "This is my fault. If I'd never—" "This is Michael Hartwell's fault," Richard snarled, "and I've dealt with his kind before." The memories surged. The courtroom, the damning evidence, the way Michael had smirked as the verdict was read, as if he knew this wasn't over. Richard had put him away once. He'd do it again, but this time it wouldn't be in a courtroom. He grabbed Daniel's arm, forcing the younger man to meet his gaze. "You said the police questioned you. That means you're a suspect. If you show up there and this goes sideways, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison." Richard's grip tightened. "Emily loved you. That's the only reason I'm not dragging you to the cops myself right now. But you're going to stay here. You're going to give me everything you have on Vay, and then you're going to let me handle this." For a long moment, Daniel stared. At him, conflict raging behind his eyes. Then, with a shuddering breath, he nodded. He handed over a flash drive, his fingers brushing the ultrasound photo still tucked in Richard's pocket. "Bring him to justice," Daniel whispered. For her, Richard didn't answer. He was already out the door, the flash drive burning a hole in his palm. The motel was a dingy, neon-lit nightmare on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people paid in cash and asked no questions. Richard parked a block away, his gun, a relic from his prosecutor days he'd hoped never to use again, heavy in his jacket pocket. The stairwell to the second floor creaked under his weight, each step a drumbeat in the silence. Room 214's curtains were drawn, but a sliver of light leaked through, casting a yellowed line across the cracked pavement. Richard didn't knock. He kicked the door in. The man inside spun, a gun already in his hand. But Richard was faster. He tackled him, the two crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and snarls. Up close, Marcus Vay was older than his mugshot, his face lined with scars and a lifetime of cruelty. But his eyes, cold and black as a shark's, were the same. "Richard Thompson," Vay rasped, grinning through bloodied teeth. "Mikey said you'd come." The sound of Vay's mocking voice sent a primal surge of fury through Richard's body, his fingers digging into the man's collar as he slammed him against the motel room's grimy wall. The gun clattered to the floor, forgotten in the haze of red, clouding Richard's vision. "You killed her," he growled, the words scraping his throat raw. "You murdered my daughter." Vay's grin only widened, a grotesque slash of yellowed teeth and arrogance, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, as if he'd wanted Richard to come. "Prove it," he taunted, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and decay. "No witnesses. No evidence. Just your word against mine. Just like old times, huh, prosecutor?" The taunt was a blade twisting in Richard's gut. He'd spent his career upholding the law, believing in justice, in systems. But the law hadn't saved Emily. The system hadn't stopped this monster from taking everything from him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Emily's voice whispered, her laughter, her idealism, the way she'd begged him once to forgive a student who'd stolen from her because everyone deserves a second chance, Dad. But this man didn't deserve mercy. He'd stolen her future. Stolen. The grandchild whose ultrasound photo still burned in Richard's pocket. His fingers tightened around Vay's throat, the man's pulse fluttering like a trapped bird beneath his thumbs. It would be so easy, so fast. Then, a crash. The motel room. Door burst open, flooding the dim space with blinding light. "Freeze! Police!" The shout was followed by the unmistakable click of safeties being switched off. Richard didn't turn, didn't loosen his grip, but in the doorway, panting and wild-eyed, stood Daniel, Sergeant Ruiz beside him with his service weapon drawn. "Richard, stop," Daniel pleaded, his voice breaking. "This is what they want. This is how they win." Vay wheezed a laugh, his lips turning blue. "Kid's right. You kill me. Hartwell's boys will make sure he disappears next. Your daughter's pretty boy. Then who's left to remember her, huh?" The words were a bucket of ice water. Richard's hands shook. Emily had loved Daniel, had chosen him, had wanted to build a life with him. And now, in some cruel twist of fate, protecting Daniel was the only way left to protect her memory, to honor the future she'd dreamed of. With a roar of anguish, Richard released Vey, letting him crumple to the floor, gasping. Ruiz was on him in seconds, cuffing him as backup swarmed the room. But Richard barely noticed. He staggered back, his knees giving out as the weight of the last week crashed over him. The funeral, the pregnancy, the letter, the loss. Daniel was at his side in an instant, gripping his shoulder, but Richard couldn't look at him. Not yet. Instead, his hand found the ultrasound photo, the edges frayed from how often he'd traced them. A life that would never be. A grandchild who would never call him Grandpa. But Emily had loved them, had believed in them. And as the sirens wailed outside, Richard made a silent promise. To her, to the ghost of that unborn child, to himself. He wouldn't let vengeance destroy what little was left of her light. He looked up at Daniel, really looked at him for the first time, saw the grief in his eyes, the love for Emily that mirrored his own. And though it shattered him to say it, the words came anyway, quiet but unshakable. Let's go home.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.